years. And I'm going to keep with my Navy brother and not show any slides today. What I found was every time I brought slides, I would never really brief from them anyways, and so the text of the slides never matched my narrative. And so I thought the easiest solution was to spare you the slides so you're not staring at something that is inconsistent with what I'm talking about today. What I am going to tell you is I'm very grateful to be here. So Mike, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. General, sir, thank you very much for your attendance. I'm very grateful to be a participant with the AFC events. I've done many of these before in my different capacities. And what I find is they're just fantastic opportunities to interact not only as a joint service, but with our industry partners and to ultimately make our force the best it could possibly be. So I'm always grateful for these opportunities. So what I hope to do today then is just take about 15, 20 minutes and tell you about what it is we're doing at the Air Staff from a cyberspace force development perspective. I've been in the job about 6 months. As Mike said, I did a joint staff assignment prior to that. So when I came back to my career field and to my Air Force, what I found was I barely recognized a lot of what I was seeing. So what I hope to share with you today is a little bit about what I've learned in that 6 months, about where we're heading and what we've learned so far and where we're moving in the right direction. And we're going to do that by breaking this into the buckets that I sort of carry as the Force Development Chief. And that's with our enlisted force, our civilian force, and our officers. And inside those three areas where we're at and what we're working on. And if I haven't hit it, at the end of that, I'll cover sort of the top 3 or 4 issues that from an Air Force cyber perspective, at least from a force development position, what we're working on at the Pentagon and what tends to dominate the discussion on a day-to-day basis at the Air Staff. So we'll start with the enlisted folks. Our cyber space operators are our 1 Bravo 4s. So I know we heard today a lot about what's going on with training here at Fort Gordon, a lot of things going on at Fort Meade. Our Air Force 1 Bravo 4s are very much a participant in that. So, sir, I'm very grateful for, I know there were 1 Bravo 4s down here, either in training or in service. What we're finding with those folks is that they're doing great things. And from a force management or a force development perspective, they're pretty healthy. We were hearing some stories maybe that we were not getting enough of the right folks or we were retaining the right folks, but a lot of that anecdotal information turned out to be just that. It was anecdotal. What we're really finding is that force is very healthy right now. And so the 1 Bravo force, through fiscal year 18 and a little bit beyond, are still going to be a retrain only force. So by that means you're coming to the 1 Bravo force from another career field inside the Air Force, not necessarily a common info or a DOTIN AFSC, could be anywhere. And in fact, just before Christmas, and when we're talking about cyber aptitude and things, Chief Bob Agard is our career field manager for the 1 Bravo force, showed me an aptitude test, or a test that we offer to the airmen that are interested in retraining into the 1 Bravo 4 career field. And one of the questions on the test is a cipher. It's just a cipher. And it says, what is this? Most of the answers we get are, hey, your code or the screen dorked up when you did the test. We can't figure out what this text means. That's most of the answers. Some folks say, rightfully, it's a cipher. Before Christmas, we got a test back that said, hey, this is a cipher. Here's the answer to the cipher, and here's the script I wrote that solved it. I said, get that kid in school now. As it turned out, he was a security forces guy. He's a cop. So that's a good news story, right? So we're finding that. Talent is out there. We're finding it from the right places. And by and large, we're getting the right folks in the job, and we're teaching them. So from a career field management standpoint, I'm pretty happy with the 1 Bravo force right now. I think probably in the out years, we're looking at another go where we'll maybe reconsider how we're bringing folks into the career field. Days way back in the old days of the Air Force, we had project managers that the Air Force had, and they were always retrainees into that field because they came blued already, and certain skill sets were already baked in so that by the time we trained them, they got it. And I think by and large, we're going to stay with that with the 1 Bravo 4s. We're rolling out a new curriculum for them next month or in March, and we'll see how that goes. And so in the out F-wise, we'll maybe bring in some from the street or from other areas. But right now, we're going to retrain in only. So that's our 1 Bravo force. The 3 Deltas, which is what we would consider the more traditional comm in the days prior to where it was mostly a cyber focus. The emphasis now where we train those folks is at Keesler Air Force Base. And so we're working on a thing called the Agile Airmen model, which, and I know you've heard this before because I've seen it up on the screen at least twice today, which is really the emphasis on the right training at the right time for the right airmen in the right position. So those things are very consistent, and I'm very happy to hear that, and I think that it should reassure all of us that we're focused on the right areas. But that Agile Airman really works on a modular training sort of emphasis. And again, I think this is consistent. What I've heard this afternoon is that old industrial age model of bringing someone in and giving them that blacksmith's apprentice sort of training model is just not fitting for the cyber and for the environment that we're in right now. The idea that you could have an apprentice and then a journeyman, then a craftsman and a master craftsman isn't fitting this. So the Agile Airman module then is to really looking at how we bring folks in, assess their aptitude right away, give them the training they need, get them on the job, and then continue that training throughout their career as they progress. So that currently you can expect to get all the training you're ever going to receive in the United States Air Force if you're an enlisted airman to stop at around the 7-year point. Well, that's just not going to work in this environment. So that's what the Agile Airman model is really getting at. I'll tell you the other big initiative that they're working on, the 3 Deltas, is enlisted developmental teams. So the officers run developmental teams through the assignment teams at our headquarters at AFPC, and we look at the individual's career, we assess where they've been, records are scored, vectors are given on different assignments for the next 3 assignments. That's how we match commanders and DOs or director of operations in the squadrons. That model is now being applied to our senior enlisted folks so that our E8s and our E9s, our chief master sergeants and our senior master sergeants are being looked at much more closely from a talent management perspective, and I'll get to that a little bit later, and also just from a developmental perspective, so that we're not just running the assignment algorithm that just crunches numbers and figures out where spaces are and puts people and faces into those spaces. This vectoring is designed to help not only give the airmen a say in where they want to go and play to the strengths that they have, but also to give the Air Force what it needs based on the skill sets. And I mentioned talent management, and I'll come back to that, but this is where we really start to dial in how we identify what special skills, training, knowledge, and abilities that our airmen have so that we can match them. This was sort of new for our enlisted force. We've run a couple of these panels for our 3 Delta E8s and our chiefs. We've done it on the 1B4. It's a much smaller career field. It's much easier to manage. There's talk about looking at it from the E7, our master sergeant's perspective, and working that. But I will tell you that's a much bigger elephant to eat. There's a lot of master sergeants. So while we work through some of the pros and cons of our E8 and E9 force, that's our top 3% of the Air Force enlisted corps, we're going to figure out a way to get to our master sergeants. At some point, I believe everyone, through our talent management system, is going to need some sort of vectoring in our cyber force. Okay, so that's our enlisted force. And I can come back to any of these if there's any questions on that. For our civilians, 2 big things that I'm looking at right now. There's some initiatives called Cyber Accepted Service. I don't know if anybody's heard that term. For me, it was sort of confusing. What I really equate this to is just an updated way, a flexible way to recruit, retain, develop our civilians, our civilian workforce, but yet still meet the Title V requirements for career status. So where it gets tough is how you bring folks in, how you recruit them. Anybody who's applied for a GS job knows how long and protracted that is. In the Air Force, I will tell you, truth in lending, it's ridiculously long. I am losing a civilian right now in my office. She got a great job. She's taken a great promotion. That's looking like a 10 to 12-month vacancy for me. Just by the time we advertise and hire and bring these on board, these folks, there has to be a better way. In this career field, we're just not going to attract the right folks if we cannot solve a way or come up with a way to bring these folks in quicker and get the right ones. And that's what the Cyber Accepted Service is supposed to do. And we're hopeful. We've seen some great progress with this. Just in the timeline alone, I've seen movement in not only days but months shorter for the onboarding process. So very excited about how that's working. And then we're working through the workforce coding right now so that we're with the nice framework and bringing in that model to identify the special cyber skills for our civilian workforce. It's a big project. The civilians are going first in the Air Force, and then we're going to apply what we learned from the civilian force into our airmen to see how that best suits and what we can apply those lessons learned for that. The one thing I will say about the workforce coding is we're finding that there's some intricacies, right, where how we define which part or so much of a person's daily duties are cyber related. And that nuance is what's really going to take the time to work through. I'm looking forward to doing it, and I think it's absolutely essential for our workforce and how we get through. So those are the enlisted force and the civilian force. Now we get up to the officers. And when I came on, that was where a lot of the attention was given, because our officer workforce, we were seeing some critical shortages in our mid-range, our majors, senior captains, majors, lieutenant colonel. We are still fighting that shortage. I'm sure everybody's heard of the shark fin or a bathtub effect. There's some key years where we just don't have the skill set. And as we try to grow that and we bring it back in, we've had to come up with some interesting, what I would really consider to be outside the box thinking on how we solve some of these problems. I know you've heard it today a little bit of the Army, and I think the Navy also mentioned the direct commissioning and the constructive credit. We're working that too. I got 2 folks identified right now that are due to start at, these are enlisted airmen that are out in the workforce right now that are coming to us with master's degrees in cybersecurity. They're coming to us with years of operational experience. What this will do is we have these 2 airmen identified as our pilot program. We have an OTS class dates for those 2 individuals that starts the end of this March. When they're commissioned, and they're going through the scrolling process right now. When they're commissioned, one will become a first lieutenant, the other will become a first lieutenant within a year. It's unlike anything I've ever heard. And how I know I'm onto something is because this is only a pilot, so it's not advertised. We weren't letting the big messages come through our headquarters and things. Within hours of reaching out to the squadron commanders that are responsible for these individuals, I had heard from both wing commanders of our cyber operations wings, and almost all of the group commanders wanting to know how they could get in on this and why weren't they included in this, because it's such a great deal. I'm very excited about it, and I think once we get these 2 through, I'm looking at about 3 to 5 more for this fiscal year. I'm hoping to get a civilian off the street so we can try to apply the same model to our just a straight off a session off the street through OTS. Right now I'm on target for an FY19 rollout with the recruiting service. So this will be just like any other program that the recruiting service runs as far as assessing our officers. But what is good about it, at least from a morale standpoint, to have folks in our squadrons that are watching their coworkers be handpicked and then suddenly become from an E6 tech sergeant into a first lieutenant is a great thing, and it seemed to be highly motivational, and we're getting a lot of good feedback on it. So I'm very excited about it, and hoping to come back here in another year and report that it's working so well that we're going to start taking 25 to 30 a year if we can pull it off. The other thing we're looking at is warrant officers. I think what the climate is on the air staff, and again, what you're hearing is Bobby Thompson's opinion, so keep that in mind. But I'm seeing an appetite to have this discussion. There were other times in my career, and I'm coming at you with almost 34 years in uniform, where the warrant officers from an Air Force perspective was a bygone era. It was discussed that we were, as a force, warrants had become obsolete and just weren't really a fit for the way the Air Force enlisted structure and the officer corps was structured. I think what you're seeing now, and what I know in the discussions that I'm having at the senior level is this is on the minds of our senior leaders. And there is an appetite to entertain a way ahead on how we can do this. I think cyber is a perfect fit for it. Our A1, our personnel office, has got some other ideas that our space operators or our RPA community could also benefit from this. But as I stand on the air staff, I have my hand raised the highest. I want to make sure that cyber goes first so that we can prove this concept and move out. So, and it's interesting, and I think the proof, or at least what validates that for me is I think back through, and we see this, right? The Hilo community, it does very well. And we've been speaking to a lot of our partners in the Army specifically, but through the Navy as well, through the LDO program and some of these, is that there are jobs in cyber, especially since this is so inherently joint, where you can benefit from having a warrant in your work center, where that technical competence is just baked into what that individual provides. And while it costs a little bit more over the long term, what you get out of that investment far outweighs any of the risks of doing that. And so we're still at the very early discussion for warrants, but I believe that we will see some version of a test. I'm making a prediction now. I'm hoping. So if anybody asks you, please beat that drum for me. And so direct commissions, constructive credit, warrant officers. The other issue with the officer career field, our 17 deltas, is our way ahead, is our future. When we're looking at how we're going to grow and develop our cyber officers, it's become clear to us that the current path where we had a pyramid, and I'm sure it's not unfamiliar to a lot of folks, where you come in and you do certain jobs as you work up this pyramid, in cyber it's just not working. The pyramid's either upside down or sideways, and we're just not managing that force right. So we're coming up with an idea, and then you hear a 17 Delta, it's a path to greatness brief, or you'll hear it called many things. It's mostly a cyber officer of the future. And we did a design sprint in August where we brought in some of the big brain thinkers from the Air Force and some experienced leaders, 05, 06, 04, and brought in some facilitators that lead this design sprint to come up with some courses of action on how we can manage the career field. This team came back with 3 recommendations. I don't think this will be unfamiliar to a lot of the folks. I know that from an Army perspective, when we're talking, we already broke out signal and cyber, so we have data guys and wire and radio guys kind of thing, right? So we're seeing a little bit of that with our own courses of action. But what I see is with this structure, it's really 3 COAs. So you're having a 17 Delta, or with another shred on their AFSC that focuses primarily on the offensive cyber only, and one that focuses primarily on the defensive, the DCO DOT and ops side, and then another area that is breaking that all into 3 AFSCs, where you have one that does OCO, one that does DCO, and one that does cyber. So there's variations of this. Where we're at is the discussion level. We were hoping to move out and have a decision on this. We were already to the end of January almost, and we're still really at the talk. And the reason it's taken so long is this is a wicked hard problem, and we have to maintain the viability of our career field and for the service and for the joint force. So we need to make sure we get this right. So where we're at is that AO level work has now been briefed to our key essential 2 stars. So we're at the 2-star level. So my boss, Major General Patrick Higbee, has been working with General Wegeman at 24th Air Force and Major General Bob Skinner at 24th Air Force at the 2-star level to get our senior leaders into an agreement on what those COAs should look like and how we're going to move forward. Last week, we just got that. So we are taking those rough outlines now and building that into a decision brief where we're actually going to game plan this out and come up with some way ahead, hoping for a decision sometime early to middle spring. we'll see. Lots to do, lots of work there, but big implications for our force. And I mentioned our 3Ds earlier. Those career field managers, Chief Lee Toole and Denzel Hellison, both Chief Master Sergeants, confided in me both that they're standing by watching what we do from a 17 Delta perspective, because how that moves out will have almost everything to do with how they move their force forward. So a lot of big rocks we're trying to kick there, but that kind of covers the enlisted, civilian, and officer way ahead, at least from my force development perspective. So I talked to you a little bit about some of the hot topics that are managed in that, but the things that are on my mind right now, or that are in the discussions on the air staff, was the talent management piece. I think probably more than any other, that's a problem that I've had at least one discussion per day since I've been there on how we get after our talent management, whether that's some sort of badging system where it's just like on Untapped, if you check in a beer, you get a badge, or some certification, you get a badge. There's some way so that we can help identify what these special skills are and then manage them. And so our personnel are working some issues. AFPC's got some plans. What we're trying to do selfishly from the cyber perspective and then from the enterprise level is find a way that we can manage this across the Air Force. So that's talent management. Cyber aptitude testing. I saw a little bit of that. I mentioned our own little test inside. I will tell you that there's a lot of talk about cyber aptitude testing, but we're not doing a lot with it right now. It's in my to-do list, and I need to get better at it. We've done some studies with the psychologists that work out of our Air Force Personnel Center. We have some folks that have on our personnel side that have been helping us work on how we identify the cyber aptitude, but we're very much at the discussion level. We need to get better at it, and we need to do it fast, because that pool on that little quad chart that I saw this morning with those dots, there's not very many of those people out there, and how we identify them is important. Whether we identify someone and say, hey, you know, you're not necessarily the right fit for the Air Force, but there are other opportunities for you, either through the civilian workforce or other services. It's important that we work this together so that we can all benefit together. So that's talent management. So cyber squadrons, enterprise IT as a service, mission defense teams, these are all terms that get mentioned every day in the course of my duties. And why that's so important is because all of those topics affect everything else I just briefed to you, whether it's the 17 Delta of the future, whether it's our 3 Deltas or our 1 Bravo force. What we are expected to do as we reorganize our squadrons and what that mission set is, who is actually providing our enterprise IT. So I'm not the expert on that, but I can tell you that with enterprise IT as a service, the idea is a lot of the base level support that has been traditionally done by blue suiters, military folks, will be contracted out or provided some other means so that mission defense, cyber focus can return to the mission and the weapon systems of that particular base. So lots of moving parts there. Colonel Sean Kern is leading that charge, and if anybody's got any questions on that, I can certainly help us get steered in that right direction. But those items really have almost everything to do then with what we do as a force. So I think that pretty well covers it. So I really wanted to leave a few minutes so that I can answer questions on any of these topics or any others from an Air Force perspective that you might have. So I appreciate your time and your attention, and we'll turn it over to the question guys. I hope there's some over there.
All right, thanks a lot. We have time for one question, and the one question is, has the Air Force considered specializing commissioned officers into an operational and a traditional comm specialization such as the Army?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, what I owe is an answer back to Congress on that. There was a question come out of the last NDAA that basically said, hey, Air Force, why aren't you doing your AFSC like the Army? And so when I tell you that we're looking through the course of these design sprints and these courses of action with our 2 stars, that's what we're trying to do, is answer that question. Yep.
Well, sir, thank you very much. That was our final question. Please welcome Mike Warlick back to the stage to formally
Okay.
thank him on behalf
Thank
of AFC and our audience.
Well, Thompson, thanks a million for that presentation. A couple of quick thoughts. Your certification badge you talked about at the end was quite interesting. The Warrant Officer program, I know it's been bannered around the Air Force for a long time. I think that's another great topic. Having those experts, I think, are essential. And what this tells me about this session we've had today is that maybe there should be some sort of an executive cyber summit for the senior trainers of the services to talk about these things in a small forum. In any case, thank you very much for that great presentation. And now you've heard from all the military services today. Again, I want to thank Colonel Thompson for taking that time, and we'll provide a donation to the Fisher House on your behalf. Before we start the next session, we have an award to present. If I could invite Mr. Gordon Miller from LGS. Mr. Miller, you here there, thank you, and Lieutenant General Bob Shea to the stage for a presentation.
Afternoon, everybody. I'll be quick. Don't worry, I know it's late in the day. LGS Innovations is very dedicated to growing and developing young engineers. So we're also very honored to be part of AFCEA and be invited to CERTS for these 2 days. So we are making a donation to the STEM scholarship program. And it'd be nice if I had a great big check, but in our days of electronic funds transfers, the money's in the bank.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, but if you look at the recent international studies that have done in terms of competitiveness between the United States education system and that of education systems of about 75 countries around the world, you would find that in reading scores, the United States ranks about 18th. In science, we're, 24th. In science, we're about 24 as well. And in math, we're ranked 39th. That is not the type of results that you want for an international and a global leader. And so I'd like to just thank again for the contribution, because this money will go to those people, that young men and women that are going to help raise our scores, we hope, going forward. So that's a pretty scary thought, and so I advise and ask all of you to think about that in terms of global competitiveness as we go forward. And that's what our Education Foundation is all about, is to fund the young men and women all the way from kindergarten through teacher grants and things of that nature, all the way through scholarships to help us to be competitive, more competitive in a very competitive world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that donation. It will go to a worthy cause. And I will also say that here, the Augusta chapter here at AFCEA also takes care of donations for STEM through the funds that they raise throughout the year, too. So they're taking care of the community as well. We'll take care of a broader picture from the AFCEA International perspective. Thank you very much again. So our next session hopefully will kind of tie the knot together this afternoon. I'm going to invite Colonel Stanton up to the stage here in just 1 second to join us today to talk about an operator's perspective of our cyber professionals. And it's a perspective from the field. And actually, I guess the panel could come walk up as I'm talking right now. It'll save a little bit of time. This may be an opportunity for you to have questions before we break this afternoon, but again, you're going to hear from different services how they think that their professionals are working for them. So I'd like to now welcome Colonel Stanton to the stage. Colonel Paul Stanton to the stage. He's the commander of the Army Cyber Protection Brigade. His previous assignment, he served as the Deputy Director of the Capabilities Division Group at the U.S. Cyber Command. So he comes to this organization well-trained, well-qualified, and he's got a tremendous team working for him. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Stanton.
Mike, I appreciate that. So when General Wood approached me several months ago and asked me if I'd be willing to moderate a panel on an operator's perspective as it relates to training and education, I jumped at that opportunity. You heard my boss, Lieutenant General Nakasone, earlier this morning talk about what it means to attempt to achieve sustainable readiness. Education and training are absolutely essential components of how we drive towards achieving readiness from a cyber perspective. And as Mike was also suggesting, if we look at the agenda from today, today's focus is pretty much on describing where we are. And if we look at the focus for tomorrow, where we have a morning full of workshops, that's supposed to help us drive towards what the next stage looks like. And an operator's perspective at the end of the day today sort of help bridge that gap. We're living it today because we have an operational and mission imperative to go forward and execute cyber operations, and we must be trained to some degree in order to achieve that. But how do we get better? What are the lessons learned that we carry back from the fight that need to inform our way ahead? And the power of the leaders and commanders that are on the stage this afternoon comes in the form of the mission. It's a forcing function. We don't have the luxury of forming a working group to decide about what we should train on next. We must be trained because the operational mission and the organizations that we support are in constant need of our services. And so we go out the door, we execute the mission, we take the lessons learned and we carry them back. The fact that we have leaders and commanders on the stage, they have the ability to exercise the decision authority to go ahead and execute the mission. And that it's that operational imperative that brings a great degree of experience. Now, we're really at the tip of a very long spear, however. This is a complex domain. There are a lot of challenges. You cannot be successful in cyber operations unless you understand the environment. That starts with education. It starts with education all the way at early stages, all the way through the execution of the training pipeline and into mission execution. And then they feed back and inform one another. And so that is the focus of the team on the stage this afternoon, is to help give you our experience of how we manage that long spear, given that we're at the tip of it in our execution. So the way we're structured the panel today, I'm going to give a quick introduction to the panelists. I'm going to ask each one of them to describe something that's working and something that may need some improvement. And then we're going to open it up for questions. And of course, as any good moderator, I have a handful of softball questions that I have prepared. But really, we want to answer the questions that you have. So please use the Ask My Certs app and send your question so that we have those teed up for the end. As I do in many capacities, I stand around with my hands on my hips and take credit for the work of other people, and I plan to do that this afternoon. So I will thank Mike Warlick and the AFCEA team for putting together an all-star panel. And in that spirit, I'd like to just give a brief introduction. Lieutenant Colonel Promotable Ben Ring is a former tank driver and armor officer in the Army. He has a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in computer science. He formerly taught computer science at West Point and currently serves as the operations officer for the Cyber Protection Brigade. Lieutenant Colonel P.H. Waters currently commands the 39th Information Operations Squadron, responsible for I.O. and cyber training for the Air Force. She was formerly the operations officer for the 92nd Cyber Operations Squadron, responsible for building CPTs. She has hands-on experience operating the Cyber Vulnerability Assessment Hunter, the CVA Hunt weapon system that is key to the Air Force's success. She's also a graduate and instructor at the Cyber Warfare Operations course and has a BS in computer engineering and a master's degree in electrical engineering. Lieutenant Colonel Barrion Woodard commands the Communication Training Battalion at the Communications Electronics School for the Marine Corps. He was formerly the Cyber Defense Capability Officer at STRATCOM, has a BS in computer science, and brings a unique perspective of how to combine cyber with the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum to the panel. And Lieutenant Junior Grade Marcus Guevara is currently a team leader for a Hunt Incident Response Team at the Department of Homeland Security. Formerly, he was a Command Duty Officer at U.S. Cyber Command and the Joint Force Headquarters, Dothan. He has a BS in Computer Science and a Master's degree in Computer Security, and brings a unique perspective of how to combine government and private industry in the execution of cyber operations. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic first to Lieutenant Colonel Ring and ask him to relay something that's working and something that we might need a little bit of work on in terms of training for the Cyber Protection Brigade. Ben?
Good evening, or good afternoon. One of the things that we in the Cyber Protection Brigade have implemented successfully is a gunnery training program. When I say gunnery, it's modeled after the Army training model based on tiers of different skill sets. So we've got a set of requirements and tasks to train our forces on our equipment to meet our missions. And there's a set that trains at the individual level, specifically on how to implement our software and our hardware. We have a set of tasks that then breaks down the different work roles so each individual can train on their assigned role. And then collectively, we can combine those different work roles into a single small unit or a crew to train at the crew level, at the small unit level. And that builds the foundation of building blocks in order to achieve operational success. And what we found is that's critical because that is the framework for mission command within the Army. And as we operationalize this and turning to one of our shortfalls that we've identified, operationally we've learned that when you execute defensive cyber operations, it's not a single CPT or a single unit in isolation and exercise. It requires multiple tasks and multiple purposes of those units operating collectively together in synchronous and in harmony. And that requires a single unity of effort under a single commander. And for those of us who have been through the Leavenworth and the Quantico and Carlisles of the world, we understand that's the application of operational art to cyber operations. And when you combine the operational art and cyber operations, this is textbook mission command. And what we found is as we execute this, we do not have the structure or the battle staffs or the force structure in above our CPTs in order to execute mission command at the operational level, and that's what we're lacking. So our personnel don't understand how to battle track. They don't understand, how to run estimates and information flow up and down the channels within the cyber force. So that's completely lacking, and that's something that's a current shortfall within the Army.
Well, and I'll highlight that as we look at training requirements going into tomorrow's workshops and how to build towards this, this is absolutely a requirement. Fighting single CPTs, that's not the experience that we have. What we've found is that if we find the adversary in one place in the network, he's likely somewhere else in the network, and it requires multiple CPTs moving in concert, which requires a degree of command and control that then requires the knowledge of how to train that. So, hey, PH, can I hand it off to you for something that works and something that needs improvement?
So something that we have that works in the Air Force. So we've been doing operations training in the Air Force since about 2011. But note that back in 2011, we had a single course that we sent all of those folks who were going to be doing OCO and DCO to the same course. And in 2015, we were able to basically break that up. So our folks who were going to be working with the Cyber Mission Force had their own track, and those who were going to be doing DODIN operations or defending the AFIN had a separate course. Just last year, we then broke it up to, there are 7 cyber weapon systems, and we were able to break it down to an operational training track for each weapon system. So instead of just training the whole populace of here's how we do OCO, DCO, we're actually focusing on not only the skills that you need to operate, but also the actual technology that you're going to be using to operate those weapon system platforms for the Air Force. So we've been able to focus our training to what those operators are going to need when they step out the door into their squadron. So that leads me also to our challenge, though. So one of the things that we see is specifically, say, for Cyber Vulnerability Assessment Hunter, that weapon system, there are a number of organizations in the Air Force that employ it, and each one of them employs it slightly differently. So in order to keep track of what's going on operationally and best build an operator's course in order to what those common knowledge areas are, what parts of the platform everyone is using, getting everyone to agree on what that is so that we can build that training has been a challenge for us.
Absolutely. As you look at scale and extending to multiple organizations, I know from a cyber command perspective, I certainly know from our cyber perspective, and I'm glad we're not in isolation in terms of the challenges of how to find what's common, vice what is niche that needs to be needs some extra degree of focus. Barian, how about from the Marine Corps?
Thank you, sir. Unlike all of my esteemed panelists, I am not a cyber operator. However, like Colonel Ford, I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So from the Marine Corps perspective, we are in the infancy stage of creating this capability to be applied in support of MAGTF operations. Up to this point, we've had one small group of 0689 cybersecurity technicians that were uniquely responsible for that responsibility in support of DOT and Ops. What we have done is realigned those cybersecurity responsibilities, and we're talking about that threat agnostic, day-to-day network hygiene, those functions, applied them across a larger population, thus increasing our surface area, if you will, for cybersecurity. What we see this actually doing is better enabling cyber situational awareness in support of those follow-on DCO actions. So that's one of the good things. We're not there yet, but we're leaning in that direction. An ongoing challenge for us is to prepare cyber operators to effectively integrate and synchronize cyber operations across all domains. As you've already heard, integral to the MAGTF is that combined arms approach. So one of the things we're looking into and how to prepare those Marines to do is those staff processes across all the warfighting functions. So that's where we are, sir.
Yeah, and you heard General Nakasone this morning allude to SEMA operations at Corps and below, so cyber electromagnetic activities in support of Corps and below, and the training challenges associated with that. I think sometimes we think, when we think education training, at least I suffer from this problem. I think of it in an enterprise network connotation, and not necessarily in the connotation of how do we train that in order to be synchronized at speed with the execution of warfare across the other domains. Huge challenges associated with that. Hey, Marcus, can you give us some examples from the Coast Guard and specifically with your experience at the Homeland Security?
Absolutely. Good afternoon. As you may know, the Coast Guard is a bit of a smaller service with less resources. So we tend to be a little bit at a disadvantage when it comes to training some of the commercial courses that are available. However, being a smaller service, we also have a little more, we have a capability of being agile and trying different things out. I'm a big believer that certification and commercial courses help to provide a good foundation. However, becoming an expert has to entail lots of practice and experience. Recently, we started a partnership with the Department of Homeland Security, and I was sent to stand up a small team under the NCIC. The NCIC has a team called the Hunt and Incident Response Team, or HURT for short. And so we took a 5-man Coast Guard active duty team to augment DHS's Hunt and Incident Response Team. So the HURT actually has the opportunity to deploy about once a month, once every other month at the very least. And so we send our members to augment them to shadow, to learn, but also then to perform the mission of hunting and incident response on industrial control systems for government and private sector entities. So one of the things that really has worked for us is, again, not having the resources for some of the education, just having a lot of hands-on training. We get a lot of experience with different companies who have large data sets where we're just able to go through the data for a couple of weeks at a time and really get a lot of experience, leverage our relationships with NSA and other military services along with DHS, and just a lot of hands-on experience has proved to be extremely good for those members. One of the things that I think we struggle with is critical thinking skills. A lot of our members do end up getting a lot of training and certifications and then have to go through a process of learning just some basic critical thinking skills, decision-making, things that I really entail more of investigation as opposed to cyber. I don't think that we get enough of that sort of training, and I think that's one of the things that we're looking into, how to get our guys up to speed on not just cyber skills, but also investigation and incident response.
Well, I would second that for certain. And I'll shoot my second warning across the bow here, in that, getting ready to open up for questions. I'm going to offer my first softball to get the panel started. But please, if you have questions, go ahead and send them to Ask Me Certs. But building on Marcus's point there of needing the critical thinking skills, that, in my mind, relies back on education. I have to have that educational foundation to understand the context. Yes, I need to have training so that I know how to employ my weapon system on my networks in support of my organizations. But if I don't understand the context, if I don't understand how it works, then I'm pigeonholed into executing a lockstep process that I've been trained on, vice being able to respond dynamically to the changing environment. And so with that, as a recovering academic playing the part of an operator currently, I'd like to ask the panel their thoughts on how we reconcile the difference between education and training, given that our audience spans that gap.
So I'll start, I guess. So we talked about earlier today, or Mr. Pollard actually brought it up, the elements that we would consider educational, those things that span all things, Windows, in our field, Windows, Linux, networking, those pieces. And across the board, all services, we see that education happening, both in the service and before you're in the service. But you're right, those are very tool agnostic type training. So and where Air Force at least has been working on that is getting that very specific, mission specific, also task-specific, platform-specific training in order to give folks a platform in order to do that and to work on that critical thinking. So the ability to not only have that education that is available to them, but also to exercise it, right? So put them in a tough situation where here's what you have, now let's problem solve through this in order to get that. So I think right now, at least from an Air Force perspective, we're somewhat mixing the two. It's not a very clear-cut line, I guess, between education and training.
So I'll take a more a slightly different approach to identify the distinctions where we draw the line between education and training. So when I look at education, I look at developing a framework for the long term. The objectives from an education should be out 3 to 5 or 10 years, depending upon the level of education that you're hitting. And if you apply it to cyberspace operations, the genre that we're all associated with, the basic foundations of network operations or networking, operating systems, and the basic fundamentals of programming. Those are the education foundations that we need to embed within our operators before they go out and fight the fight. And then once they get out of the academia and they get into an operational unit, then it's a transition to, now that you've got a foundation, a base, let me train you on how to use our equipment, how to meet our missions, and how to execute our tasks. So when you go through a training regimen, upon completion of that training, you are trained, qualified, and certified to meet the mission. That gives us a quantifiable measurement of how we can measure readiness for our units. And that's where that's where I draw the difference between training versus education.
From a Marine Corps perspective, it's imperative that we find the right balance. And what I mean by that, time is a critical resource, right? And while we all recognize the importance of education, we also have limitations on the time we can spend towards that education. We still got to get to the training for a specific set of tools, equipment that we have available. So what is the right mix of education versus training to both meet the mission and effectively accomplish the task at hand? The way we kind of look at it at the schoolhouse is, and this audience will appreciate this, I think, for the computer scientists in the room, when you start thinking about programming, you don't go to a programming class first. That first class is kind of an introduction to problem solving, where you're talking about concepts, agnostic of a particular programming language, right? But you're talking about data structures, just generally. You're talking about, hey, I know I have to do comparisons and all of those things, right? And then when you go to learn that first programming language, now all you're looking at are the syntax and the semantics for that particular language. I think this is no different. And for a Marine, being able to be adaptable, have an understanding of the system in general, as new equipment is available, as things change, having a solid education makes you able to respond to whatever the challenge of the day is.
Before I commissioned in the Coast Guard, I actually enlisted into the Air Force. Before I was in the Air Force, I was a software developer for a number of years for a grocery company in Texas called HEB, large grocery company. I know you're wondering how I had time to do all that because I look like I'm 18. So I remember when I first stepped foot as a software developer into that building, I had 4 years of education in computer science, and I felt like I had no idea how to do the job. I was totally at a loss. Took me about 6 months to really get a good handle on what I was supposed to be doing, and a lot of that just simply came from shadowing people, being mentored, trying different things out and failing, making mistakes, and ultimately having people there that had been there for 5, 10, and 18, 20 years. I believe that education gives us a great framework, but training right now is one of the things that I think is really plaguing the military because cyber moves so rapidly. We don't have enough people, we don't have experts that we can rely on. Our guys don't come into a place where things are so established that they can just fall into the current and just be swept with it. They don't have guys that have been there for 5, 10, or 15 years because everybody's moving, in and out of their role every 2, 3, or 4 years. And I feel like we have to start the process all over again every couple of years. So part of that, I don't know, is that it's solved through simply better certification programs or better training programs. Some of that is going to have to, I think, come from establishing specialties where people can stay in place for a little bit longer to help mentor the guys who are coming in, at least until it becomes a thing that's consistent enough that guys can come in and out and not have to rely so much on the particular skill set of the people that are in the office.
So, huge point there, that operational experience matters a great deal. How do you balance it? So if you think about what Barian was talking about in the timelines that are associated with it, it's a huge investment for folks in education. As an example, we have 4 operators within the Cyber Protection Brigade that have spent the past 10 months in an educational environment, learning how to perform sequence selection iteration, learning the fundamentals of operating systems, learning the fundamentals of networking. Hugely important. But for the past 10 months, I've been without 4 of my best operators. because they're in an educational environment. Training, absolutely critical. But what happens when the op tempo exceeds your ability to train? I'll apologize up front when I exit the stage at 17:45 on the nose, but I have to get back to Fort Gordon tonight. Ops matter. And so how do you balance that? But if you don't have the experience, if you don't have some ounce of experience and understanding, how do you then come back and inform what you need to train on and what you need to educate the force? And trying to strike that balance is a huge challenge that all of us, I think, need to help work through. With that, I'll please pass it over for the first question, hopefully.
Thank you. The questions are for the panel writ large, not directly to any one member. So the first question is, are your operators arriving at your unit trained in the right skills, or is the unit retraining needed given the adaptive enemy and their new tactics and techniques? And if so, how is that additional training done, and can you use help with this particular task?
I can speak on behalf of the Air Force. So I will say that every operator who graduates through the pipeline will need some additional training when they get to the ops unit. Most of that training right now for our operators is going to be in the form of what we call mission qualification training. So this is the AOR that you are going to go operate in. Here is the specifics, in addition to what you've already gotten at your training, here is the specifics of what portions of the equipment that we use. And so they will spend anywhere from a week to, it really depends on the mission set, especially if they're going to be doing a specialty set, how long they're going to need to do that. But they are going to be needing training. Now, as far as where that training can come from, well, it really depends on what mission they're going to support. So if they're going to go support, say, an ICS SCADA type mission, that's somewhere where we can look to industry potentially for a start. But it really depends on what they're going to go do.
So I'll kind of dovetail on the specialty training. That is not, it's not inherent in any pipeline training anywhere, even in the force or even outside of the force. If we have a specialized mission, ICS SCADA, for example, where you need to train and assess, you need to assess the specialized systems, you need to go out and find that specialized training. And so what we've done in the Cyber Protection Brigade is we went out and we identified what are those specialized skills, those advanced skills that you're just not going to find anywhere else. And the skills are not resident to train within the Army or within the DoD even. So we identified ICS SCADA as one of them, wireless networks or enterprise database systems, some of the other specialties. And for ICS SCADA, we partnered with industry and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we aligned one team specifically with that mission set. And they spent a good part of a year identifying what are the different tiers of skills, where can I get some civilian training through something like SANS, and then what are the industry standards and certifications that they can achieve so they can embed with the operators on the ICS SCADA and some of the hydroelectric dams and some of the other systems in order to defend and protect those systems. And that's how we got after that problem set.
So I'll take an opportunity to pile on as well. In terms of speaking from an Army perspective, and more narrowly even from a Fort Gordon perspective and a Cyber Center of Excellence and a cyber school perspective, we are aggressively working towards ensuring that our curriculum in the educational environment stays current with the operational need. So the fact that General Morrison and General Hersey live right down the street is very powerful. So that as teams go out and execute mission, when we discover that there's something that we didn't know collectively, it's one of those common skills that teams need, but we didn't actually have it, that's instant feedback. It's instant feedback that then the schoolhouse looks to incorporate into the next iteration of the curriculum and the next iteration of teaching that course. I'll argue as a former infantryman, that's not common. That's not the way that we do it across the rest of Training and Doctrine Command, but it's absolutely applicable to the way we fight cyber based on the rate of change of the environment and the agility that the adversary has in throwing different techniques at us.
Well, I don't know if I'm completely off the reservation with this, but,
That's okay, you're only 18, right?
That's right, sir. I can use that as an excuse. So I don't know if, I think one of the things that we've had discussions about is how, and this is not just in the military, but I think even in private sector as well as the academia, is that cyber just seems to be this all-encompassing word that you can just throw at anything. And, I think some of the things are so specialized that we sometimes do ourselves a real disservice by trying to make people specialists within 6 months. I think I don't know enough to really speak on this from an expert opinion, but in the medical field, there is the generic medical field. There's people who take biology. There are things that you have to know. But then to perform certain actions, you have to spend years worth of education, but also practice, to become a brain surgeon or something along that sort. And I think sometimes we see somebody in the field has a brain tumor and they need surgery, and then we think, well, how do we incorporate that into the initial training so that these guys can come out with that skill set? And I don't know that that's actually possible. So I think sometimes at some point, there's just going to be growing pains for us to figure out what exactly those specialized skill sets are that we cannot fit into the initial training, and then at some point just stop trying to do that, and then figure out how do we create a pipeline where a guy can go through initial training, come out, perform for a couple of years, and then decide that they want to become a specialist in ICS or blue teaming or red team. Those are very, very different functions. Blue team and red team, I did penetration tests in red teaming, and then I came over to the hunt incident response, and I didn't really know anything about incident response, even though I had some experience with breaking into systems. And so I think at some point it might be that we recognize that there's a level of foundational knowledge that they have after years of experience. Then we can turn them into an expert and send them to additional training where they get the specialization.
I don't think that's off the mark at all. In fact, I've used the same analogy to the medical community multiple times myself. And I think it tees up a little R requirement to carry into conversation tomorrow about how do we do continuous assessment. If everyone comes out of the foundational training and the educational model at some baseline, how do we determine what you should then focus on? What aptitude do you have that actually sets you up for success in some specialty field? I think it's something to consider. Do we have another question?
Yes, thanks. The next question is, there's a perception that industry white hat and gray hat cyber researchers and operators are way ahead of what the military has been doing in cyber. What are you doing to embed your cyber warriors with industry partners that are actively doing threat hunting and intelligence gathering to learn how industry approaches cyber operation and then bring those lessons learned back to the services?
May I introduce Marcus? So I'm gonna push you in front of the bus, Marcus, and make you answer that first, but then we'll let the rest of the panel pile on. Go ahead, please.
Well, I think that's exactly what the idea we had was in the Coast Guard, because I was a battle watch captain for a watch floor for a couple of years. As we were trying to stand up and build our CPT, we didn't have enough of that platform or the capability to go out and perform the functions that we needed to teach our guys. So we saw an opportunity that DHS had that capability where they got a lot of experience, and we figured we could just throw our guys into it so that they could, number one, get the experience, but number two, bring back something where we could then figure out how we're going to leverage Coast Guard authorities. Currently, DHS there's a couple of different ways that they go on either a hunt or an incident response. Either a private company, an energy sector or nuclear plant or something along those lines, if it's critical infrastructure, will contact DHS and say, I think we've been hacked, can you come help us out? Or the FBI will be on an active investigation, will find something, let us know, and then we'll notify the victim and request to be requested to come out. And so when that happens, DHS is in the position where they are being invited. So as soon as the inviter doesn't want them there, they can rescind that. Coast Guard has some authorities in ports and waterways where law enforcement, we might be able to invite ourselves if it's a critical function, something that will impact the country at large. The Coast Guard may have some authorities that we can leverage. We don't know exactly how we would do that yet or what that means, but this is one of the ways that we were trying to figure that out, not just from a theoretical perspective, but with getting some hands-on training after a couple of years. We bring back some guys and say, hey, what did you do? How did you do it? And then we get the lawyers together and figure out, okay, where's our